Something is moving now, not in the loud, obvious way the world usually announces change, but underneath it, beneath routine, beneath distraction, beneath the polished surface people use to pretend they are not being summoned. Even if you do not follow astrology, even if you have never studied transits or signs or houses, you may feel it in your body. A pressure, a restlessness, a sense that the waiting season is beginning to crack. There are chapters in life that move like winter traffic, frozen, delayed, dense with hesitation. Plans stall out. Messages remain unsent. Decisions circle the mind for weeks, then months, without ever becoming movement. You tell yourself more time is needed, better timing, more certainty. But every so often, the atmosphere changes without asking permission. A threshold appears. The air sharpens. What felt distant suddenly feels immediate. What was buried begins to rise. And the silent part of you, the part that has watched, swallowed, and endured, leans in close and says, "Enough. Move." That is the territory we are entering now. Venus is crossing into Aries. And no, this is not small. This is not decorative astrology. This is not background weather. This is a live current. Venus rules desire, attachment, pleasure, value, beauty, the magnetic pull of what the heart cannot stop reaching for. Aries rules ignition, raw initiative, instinct, nerve, the first strike of will before doubt has time to dress itself up as wisdom. When these two forces meet, desire stops being passive. It stops whispering from the back row. It stands up. It names itself. It wants motion. You may feel it as a sudden need to begin what you have delayed. A conversation you keep postponing. A risk you have been translating into excuses. A creative vision that has followed you like a shadow, asking to be born. A decision that returns at 3 in the morning and will not leave you alone. That feeling is not meaningless. It is not random, emotional static. It is the signal that your life is pressing against the walls you built to contain it. And here is the part people miss. These openings are real, but they are not permanent. There are windows in time when courage comes easier, when clarity sharpens, when one honest move creates consequences far beyond itself. This is one of those windows. Miss it, and nothing explodes on the spot. There is no dramatic alarm. The door simply begins to close. The heat cools. The mind retakes control. What felt urgent becomes abstract again, and many people will call that being practical, when in truth, they have only backed away from the moment that could have changed the story. In this video, we are going to break down what Venus in Aries actually activates, why it can feel like an internal summons, and how to work with this energy before hesitation drains its power. We are also going to confront the quiet killer of momentum during a transit like this: overthinking. The endless mental spiral that disguises fear as intelligence and keeps people standing still while destiny passes by in plain clothes. So, if you have felt that inner pull lately, if something in you is done waiting, done shrinking, done pretending not to know, then stay with me. This message may have reached you right on time. And before we go deeper, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you are watching from or what part of this message hit home. I read more than you think, and I want to hear what is already stirring in you. Now, we need to name what is really happening here. Because this is not just a mood shift, not just a passing spike of emotion, and not some decorative spiritual language meant to make ordinary hesitation sound mystical. Something precise is taking place. When Venus enters Aries, a dormant region of the inner life begins to heat up. A threshold forms between longing and action, and many people, even those who have never cared about astrology itself, begin to feel a strange and unmistakable change in their atmosphere all at once, but clearly enough to know that something in them is no longer willing to remain asleep. To understand why this transit hits with such force, you have to understand the two powers meeting inside it. Venus is not weak energy. Venus is not merely romance, beauty, or surface attraction. Venus is the law of desire, in its deeper form. It rules what the heart reaches for when no one is watching. It governs attachment, value, pleasure, meaning, artistry, devotion, and the invisible magnetism that pulls us towards certain people, certain paths, certain futures. Venus reveals what nourishes the soul beyond mere survival. It shows where life feels vivid, intimate, worth deeply inhabiting. It tells the truth about what we love, what we miss, what we ache for, and what we can no longer fake indifference toward. Aries speaks a different language. Aries does not negotiate with delay. Aries is the flame at the front of the zodiac. The first impulse. The strike of movement, before self-doubt can begin its sermon. It rules beginnings, nerve, instinct, initiative, appetite, forward motion. It does not require perfect conditions. It is not concerned with appearing polished, only with being alive enough to begin. Where other energies may circle a choice for weeks, Aries cuts through the fog and says, step, try, move, find out on the way. So when Venus crosses into Aries, desire is no longer content to remain elegant, private, or hypothetical. It becomes urgent. It becomes embodied. What once lived as a quiet preference, a hidden ache, a private curiosity, starts asking for expression. This is why the emotional field changes during this transit. People begin noticing pressure where there used to be passivity. A low internal voltage starts rising. Restlessness appears without explanation. The things you have postponed with logic begin returning with force. The conversation you avoided, the creative work you kept saying you would start later, the truth you buried under diplomacy, the longing you minimized because it threatened the life you have arranged. Under this sky, those things do not stay buried easily. This is where many people get caught off guard. They think courage always arrives as confidence. It doesn't. Sometimes it arrives as irritation with your own excuses. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion with delay. Sometimes it arrives as the sudden inability to keep performing emotional neutrality in a place where your soul has chosen. Venus in Aries has a way of exposing that point. It reveals where you are no longer meant to merely contemplate your life, but enter it. And that realization can feel both electrifying and severe, because once you see the next step, pretending not to see it costs more than movement. You may notice this energy in relationships first. Unspoken feelings become heavier to carry. Standards sharpen. Mixed signals become intolerable. What you need from intimacy, connection, loyalty, desire, and honesty becomes harder to dilute for the sake of convenience. You stop asking only who wants you and begin asking what kind of love is worthy of your spirit. For others, the shift shows up in work, art, calling, and ambition. A neglected idea starts pulsing again. A direction that once seemed unrealistic begins to look necessary. A project left on the back shelf starts feeling less like an option and more like an instruction. That is because this transit does not merely awaken desire. It shortens the distance between desire and response. Normally, people can spend endless time interpreting themselves. They analyze the feeling. They compare outcomes. They wait for the ideal hour, the ideal mood, the ideal guarantee. Aries has no reverence for that kind of paralysis. It does not erase wisdom, but it does strip away the luxury of endless postponement. Under Venus, in Aries, the first signal often matters. The first honest impulse, the first yes, the first clear no. The first instinct that arrives before fear starts multiplying its arguments. This is not recklessness. This is contact with unedited truth. And there is another layer here people often miss. Venus usually turns our attention toward bonding, harmony, affection, and shared experience. But Aries inserts a necessary question into that landscape. What do you want when all the noise falls away? Not what keeps peace. Not what looks acceptable. Not what earns approval. What actually ignites you. What feels alive, immediate, real. This transit can feel confrontational for that reason. It does not let you hide forever inside adaptation. It asks whether your choices are truly yours. What makes this window so potent is speed. It can create turning points through seemingly minor acts. One text, one conversation, one application, one confession, one refusal, one decision made without a committee of ghosts in your head. And once movement begins, life begins answering. New information appears, energy returns, synchronicities sharpen. Doors that seemed sealed start showing seams. The whole field changes because you changed your level of participation. That is the essence of Venus in Aries. It is the hour when longing stops sitting in the shadows and steps into command. It is the collision of heart and nerve. It is the moment inspiration puts on shoes. And if you have been waiting for a sign that it is time to trust the spark, speak the truth, begin the thing, or move toward what has been calling your name, this may be it. Not someday, not when fear becomes silent. Now, while the gate is open, one of the clearest signs of this period is that the shift does not remain in the mind as an abstract idea. It descends into the body. It becomes pressure, not chaos, not panic, not some theatrical upheaval, but a concentrated internal weight that is difficult to dismiss once it begins. You feel it in pauses that suddenly seem too long, in delays that no longer feel neutral, in the sense that something in your life has reached its limit, even if nothing visible around you has changed yet. From the outside, the scenery may look the same, but beneath that surface, momentum is gathering. A hidden current is starting to pull. This is why so many people experience this phase not as inspiration alone, but as a push, a pressure point forming inside the self. Plans that once felt distant now begin to feel close enough to touch. Emotions that were easy to numb begin pressing against the ribs. Decisions you thought you could postpone begin returning with unsettling precision. They wait at the edge of your attention until you understand that something is asking to be answered. That is the nature of Aries when it is fused with Venus. Aries does not hover politely in the background. It does not ask for endless deliberation. It moves forward by design. It reveals what has outlived its delay. And when that force touches Venus, the realm of desire, attachment, longing, intimacy, value, and emotional truth, what was hidden tends to rise. What was once easy to keep private becomes harder to contain. Buried intentions start taking shape. Unspoken feelings begin asking for language. What you have been avoiding in love, work, art, identity, in your own becoming, starts stepping into the light with insistence. You may notice this in ways that look small from the outside, but feel enormous within. A project you have been circling for months begins to feel less like an option and more like a mandate. A change in career, environment, or direction that once felt too disruptive now begins to look like the honest next move. A private ache you managed to keep beneath routine suddenly refuses to stay buried. Under ordinary circumstances, most people can override these signals. They tell themselves later. They call it timing. They postpone the reckoning and go back to maintenance mode. But during a window like this, postponement begins to feel heavier than motion. Standing still starts costing more energy than stepping forward. That internal pressure can be disorienting at first, especially because it often arrives before external evidence does. Nothing dramatic may have happened, yet inwardly something begins rearranging itself. Awareness sharpens. Desire becomes legible. You start noticing what has been buried under repetition, responsibility, politeness, fear. This is why these passages in time often carry the atmosphere of a turning point. They illuminate the distance between your current life and the life that has been quietly trying to reach you. That realization is not always comfortable. Sometimes it lands as irritation, grief, impatience, or holy dissatisfaction. But even the discomfort has intelligence in it. Growth rarely begins by making us comfortable with our limits. More often, it begins by exposing what no longer fits, what no longer nourishes, what no longer tells the truth. Aries has a way of stripping the padding off a situation. Suddenly, the mind is less captivated by endless possibility and more interested in what is immediate, real, and alive enough to act on now. That does not mean every impulse should be obeyed blindly. This is not a sermon in favor of recklessness. It is a call to notice that emotional signals during this period can arrive with unusual clarity. When something matters, Aries intensifies the message. The energy itself is directional. It wants expression. It wants embodiment. It wants to close the gap between inner knowing and outer action, and not everyone experiences that as excitement. For some, it arrives as restlessness that can no longer be soothed by familiar comforts. Situations that once seemed acceptable start feeling airless. Patterns you once tolerated begin to feel misaligned. Environments that used to provide security may suddenly feel too small for who you are becoming. The discomfort is not necessarily a sign that something is wrong. Often, it is a sign that something is ready. This is how major decisions usually enter a life. Not as lightning from a clear sky, but as a long accumulation of quiet evidence. There is usually a season of internal rehearsal before the moment of movement arrives. A long conversation with yourself that nobody else hears. And then one day the voice inside you stops suggesting and starts declaring, enough waiting. Enough translating desire into delay. Enough negotiating with a truth you already know. That is the threshold Aries activates, the passage from contemplation into action. For one person, it may mean speaking with brutal honesty about what they feel. For another, it may mean making the first concrete move toward a dream they have carried in silence for years. For someone else, it may be even simpler and more sacred than that. The decision to stop abandoning themselves every time change asks for courage. If this pressure has been building in you, do not dismiss it because it did not arrive suddenly. Some of the most decisive moments in life enter quietly. They announce themselves not through spectacle, but through persistence. Through the repeated return of an idea, a longing, a knowing, a direction. Through the growing awareness that remaining the same is no longer peace. It is resistance. And that is the real message in this transit. The pressure is not here to torment you. It is here to reveal where your life is already trying to move. Your task is not to panic. Your task is to recognize the opening, trust what has become impossible to ignore, and answer the moment before the gate begins to close. One of the deepest powers in this passage is not dramatic at all. It is the power of the first signal, the first flash, the first inner yes that rises before the noise arrives. During Venus in Aries, that first response matters because it often carries a kind of truth the rational mind is too guarded or too frightened to admit. Before fear begins its performance, there is a brief, clean moment when you simply know. Most people have been trained to mistrust that moment. We are taught to pause, to qualify, to examine, to protect ourselves from uncertainty by thinking longer and harder. So the instant an idea appears, the mind moves in with its clipboard and fluorescent lights. It asks for evidence, guarantees, backup plans. It imagines embarrassment, failure. Every reason, this is not yet the hour. In ordinary situations, some of that caution may be useful. But under Venus in Aries, too much analysis can become self-betrayal. This energy does not speak in committee language. It speaks in ignition. Aries is ruled by initiation. It trusts the original spark. It honors the impulse that appears before hesitation, edits it into something smaller, safer, and more acceptable. When Venus enters this terrain, desire stops presenting itself as a distant preference and begins arriving like a directive. You may feel it as the urge to send the message, make the call, begin the draft, tell the truth, apply for the thing, or move toward what has been calling your name in private. That first pull does not come wrapped in a perfect plan. It comes as recognition, and then the second voice enters. The doubting voice, the managerial voice, the one that asks whether you are qualified, whether the timing is wrong, whether people will misunderstand you, whether you should wait until you are more polished, more certain, more invulnerable. In seconds, the clean instinct becomes crowded. The simple next step becomes a maze. The energy drops. What was alive begins to cool. This is how momentum dies for most people, not because the sign was false, but because they mistook fear for wisdom. That is why this period is so consequential. Under Venus in Aries, the first spark often carries more voltage than usual. It is charged. If you move with it, momentum begins to gather around you. If you hesitate too long, the opening narrows, then disappears, and what felt vivid starts to seem theoretical again. Think about how many defining moments in a life begin almost invisibly. A single text that opens the door to a relationship. A private decision that becomes the first brick of a new career. A sentence spoken aloud after years of silence. They begin as subtle acts of obedience to an instinct that made no public spectacle of itself. This is the hidden teaching of Aries energy. Clarity is often a result of motion, not a prerequisite for it. You do not always see the whole road before you step onto it. Often the path reveals itself only after you have agreed to move. New information comes because you acted. New options become visible because you stopped standing outside your own life, waiting for certainty to descend from the ceiling. Life usually gives confirmation after participation. That does not mean every impulse is sacred. It means you must learn the texture of intuition. Intuition is usually spare, direct, quiet, but unmistakable. Fear is louder. It multiplies scenarios. It keeps talking long after the truth has already been spoken. During Venus in Aries, this distinction becomes critical. Some ideas keep returning because they are carrying instruction. A name comes back to mind. A direction keeps glowing at the edge of your attention. A project, a confession, a pivot. A beginning repeats itself with the same low burn. That repetition is not there to haunt you. It is there to guide you, and the threshold is smaller than people think. You do not need to reinvent your life by midnight. You need one honest move. Write the note, send the email, open the document, speak the sentence. Claim the desire without reducing it to something easier to manage. That is enough to open the channel. Once motion begins, the next step often rises to meet you. This is why so many transformations look sudden from the outside. People only see the visible result. They do not see the private second when someone stopped arguing with their own knowing and obeyed it. They do not see the moment a person chose instinct over delay, aliveness over caution, participation over spectatorship. That is where the shift begins. Not in noise, not in performance. In one clean decision, in real time. To trust the first flame before the world has time to talk you out of it. One of the most overlooked truths about this energy is that it does not stay open forever. Venus in Aries creates a narrow but potent interval, a living window in which desire, courage, and clarity rise together. It appears, brightens, and asks a question. Will you move while the current is here? Or will you stand at the edge until the water has already changed? That is why this period can feel so charged in the beginning. The signal is unusually clear. Something that once felt intimidating suddenly feels possible. An idea that lived in the background of your life begins stepping forward. A conversation you kept postponing feels less impossible. A project you kept delaying starts to feel strangely alive in your hands. The body senses it before the mind can fully explain it. There is excitement, yes, but also a sharper feeling underneath it, as though some buried part of you recognizes that timing itself has shifted. And yet this is also where people lose the thread. They ask for more certainty, more planning, more proof. On the surface, this can look wise. But delay does not always come from wisdom. Sometimes it comes from fear, dressed in adult language. Sometimes it comes from the part of the mind that would rather preserve control than enter the unknown. Aries does not linger there for long. This energy moves quickly. It rewards engagement. It gathers force around action, not speculation. If you respond while the current is alive, momentum starts forming around your choice. If you wait too long, the voltage drops. What felt obvious on one day can feel negotiable a few days later. What felt lit from within can begin fading back into uncertainty. The courage that was once available at close range begins stepping backward, and doubt re-enters with its old familiar script. Maybe later. Maybe not yet. Maybe when the conditions are cleaner, safer, less exposed. But conditions are not always the real issue. Often the real issue is that momentum has a lifespan. That is the hidden law here. The opening does not remain equally open. The emotional charge that made action feel natural can weaken when it is not used. The idea that once felt vivid can become cloudy again. The opportunity that seemed almost within reach can drift just far enough away for the mind to call it impractical. And what makes this especially dangerous is that the window does not close with drama. No alarm sounds. No voice announces that the hour has passed. Life continues. The unfinished work is still there. The person you meant to reach is still moving through their day. On the outside, almost nothing changes. But internally, the clean edge of the moment begins to soften. Not always immediately. Sometimes days pass. Sometimes weeks. Then, one night, the memory returns. The message you almost sent. The truth you almost spoke. The work you almost began. The move you almost made. And with that memory comes a very specific kind of regret. Not the regret of failure. Failure at least has motion inside it. Failure means you answered the call and learned what happened next. The heavier regret is quieter than that. He's 7. There's opping. He's 7 popular. This action of the car. He's 7 popular. It is the recognition that you stood near a real opening and chose to wait until the force that created it had already thinned. This is why recognizing windows of momentum matters so much. Timing is not everything, but it is never nothing. There are seasons when movement is more supported than usual, when the atmosphere around a decision becomes lighter, cleaner, more responsive. During those times, even a small action can carry disproportionate weight. A single text can begin a relationship. A single admission can alter the emotional structure of a bond. A single application, pitch, draft, or declaration can shift the architecture of what comes next. The action itself may look minor from the outside, but because the timing is alive, it travels farther than expected. That is one of the real gifts of Venus in Aries. It does not promise perfection. It does not guarantee that every risk will unfold exactly as imagined. Life is too wild for that, but it does create a field in which initiative tends to meet response more quickly. It shortens the distance between inner knowing and outer consequence. It makes courage feel more accessible. It makes decisions feel less heavy. And once the first move is made, something almost always changes. Fear loosens, confusion thins. The path that looked tangled starts separating into visible steps. Sometimes the required move is deeply personal. Tell the truth to the person who matters. Stop editing your feelings into something easier to manage. Sometimes the move is practical. Start the project. Send the proposal. Leave the dead space. Choose the direction you already know belongs to you. Sometimes the move is almost invisible. One note written, one call returned, one first step that tells life you are no longer willing to live only in rehearsal, because that is the turning point. The moment action begins, fear loses part of its grip. Not all of it, but enough. The imagined complexity of the road gives way to actual movement. The fragile spark becomes something more solid. What felt like a possibility starts becoming a sequence. What felt like inner pressure becomes reality in motion. So if you can feel the opening now, do not wait for it to become louder. It may not. Sacred timing is often clearest at the beginning. Your task is not to force the future. Your task is to recognize when the field is open and answer while it still is. That is how the story changes. Not through noise, not through grand performance, but through one honest act taken in the brief, luminous hour when courage, desire, and timing all say the same thing. Now, not later. Today. One of the dangerous things about this transit is that the force most capable of killing its momentum rarely looks dangerous at all. It looks reasonable. It sounds intelligent. It presents itself as maturity, self-control, discernment, prudence. It comes dressed as discipline. But beneath that polished surface, it is often the same saboteur, overthinking. And during Venus in Aries, overthinking is not a habit. It is a quiet thief. It steals heat from the moment. It drains life from instinct. It takes a living signal and turns it into a courtroom, where every desire is cross-examined until its fire goes cold. This is what makes it so deceptive. In many parts of life, reflection is valuable. Strategy matters. Preparation matters. Thoughtfulness matters. But not every moment is asking for the same medicine. Some moments are asking for precision. Others are asking for courage. Venus in Aries belongs to the second category. This is a transit of ignition. It responds to willingness, to movement, to the brave first act that tells life you are no longer content to stand outside your own becoming. The problem is that when this energy arrives, many people try to meet it with the wrong instrument. They answer fire with hesitation. They answer a summons with analysis. And without realizing it, they begin extinguishing the thing they prayed would appear. Overthinking rarely begins as obvious fear. It begins with a spark. You feel a pull towards something meaningful. A message rises in you that wants to be sent. A conversation you have postponed starts pressing harder against your chest. A project you have imagined for months feels possible. A decision you have avoided begins returning with clarity. At first, the signal is simple. It carries excitement, nervous aliveness, a sense of inner alignment. Something in you knows, not abstractly, not theoretically. It knows in the way the body knows when the weather is changing before the sky fully shows it. Then the second voice arrives. What if this is the wrong time? What if I misread the sign? What if I fail publicly? What if I reach out and get silence back? What if I begin and realize I am not ready? What if I choose and then have to become someone new? The questions multiply, and each one seems innocent on its own. Each one sounds defensible, responsible even. But together, they create an interior fog. The original signal becomes harder to hear. The energy that was moving cleanly starts fragmenting into doubt. What had the shape of a next step now feels like 1,000 impossible variables. That is the seduction of overthinking. It makes paralysis feel earned. And that is precisely why it is so destructive during Venus in Aries. This transit does not reward endless interpretation. It rewards contact, participation, motion, even small motion, especially small motion. Aries does not require a masterpiece to begin. It requires a first move, a message, a sentence, a draft, a decision, a hand reaching toward what feels alive. When you interrupt that impulse with relentless mental rehearsal, the spark begins to thin. Courage weakens. Desire becomes negotiable again. The mind reclaims command and calls it wisdom, while your deeper life goes back into the waiting room. The tragedy is that many people mistake this process for productivity. They tell themselves they are being careful. They say they are gathering information. They frame delay as responsibility. But often, what they are really doing is trying to protect themselves from exposure. They are trying to avoid the vulnerability of action. Because action changes things. Action reveals where you stand. Action opens the possibility of rejection, but it also opens the possibility of reality. And that is what fear hates most. Reality. Fear prefers rehearsal. Fear prefers control. Fear would rather keep you circling a threshold forever then let you discover what happens when you cross it. This is why learning the texture of fear versus intuition matters so much under this sky. Fear is noisy. It repeats itself. It floods the mind with scenarios. It speaks in loops. It keeps asking for one more guarantee, one more sign, one more layer of certainty before permission can be granted. Intuition does not behave that way. Intuition is spare, direct, almost inconvenient in its simplicity. It does not always shout, but it lands cleanly. It says, "Send it. Start here. Say it now. Go." Its honesty is part of what makes it so easy to distrust, because it leaves no place to hide. During Venus in Aries, that intuitive signal becomes important. It acts like a compass point, illuminated in real time. Not a full map, not a promise of success, but a true direction. And one of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming they need to see the whole staircase before taking the first step. They wait for complete confidence, perfect readiness, airtight plans. Meanwhile, the energy that could have carried them begins to dissipate. The opening narrows. The inner voltage lowers. They tell themselves they are still considering their options, when in reality, they are watching the tide go out there. But this transit carries a different lesson. Clarity often comes after movement, not before it. The path sharpens because you entered it. New information appears because you acted. The next contact is made because you sent the first message. The better idea arrives because you started with the imperfect one. Movement generates revelation. Stillness only magnifies the questions already living in your head. This is why a seemingly minor act during Venus in Aries can hold such disproportionate power. It does not need to be dramatic to be decisive. A small, deliberate action is often enough to keep the channel open. Write the note, make the call, open the file, say the truth without dressing it in excessive disclaimers. Submit the application, book the meeting, take the first step toward the thing you keep claiming you will begin when the time is right. Under this transit, these small acts are not small in effect. They send a signal. They tell life you are available for the next sequence. They tell your own nervous system that instinct can be trusted. They interrupt the reign of mental delay and restore the bond between desire and action. And once that bond is restored, something remarkable begins to happen. Confidence grows, not as a theory, but as a result. The next decision becomes easier because the first one proved survivable. Then the next step follows with less resistance. Then another. Momentum starts forming its own weather around you. Doors that once looked sealed reveal openings. Conversations begin moving with less strain. People respond differently. Opportunities that seemed distant begin entering the room. From the outside, it may look sudden, as though things started aligning all at once, but the real turning point happened earlier. In private, the moment you refuse to let overthinking speak with final authority. This is the feedback loop Venus in Aries can create when you honor it. Courage leads to movement. Movement produces evidence. Evidence strengthens trust. Trust makes the next courageous act more accessible. Then, life, which had nothing to respond to while you remained frozen, begins answering your participation. This is how a season changes. This is how a person changes, not through a perfect master plan, but through repeated acts of alignment with what. So, overthinking is not just an annoying tendency during this transit. It is a revelation. It shows you exactly where fear has occupied the control room. It shows you where you have confused caution with wisdom and delay with safety. If you can recognize it while it is happening, you gain your power back. You can interrupt the spiral. You can return to the clean signal underneath the noise. You can act while the current is still alive. That is the rare gift here. Venus in Aries opens a field where action is amplified. A single honest move can set off consequences far larger than itself. A brief, sincere act of courage can reconfigure the emotional landscape of the days that follow. Acting on instinct in a period like this does not merely help you make progress. It tells life you are ready to meet it halfway. And once life feels that readiness, it often begins moving toward you with surprising speed. What begins here may look small enough to ignore. A message, a sentence, a decision made in private, a first move no one else would recognize as destiny in motion. And yet that is exactly how this energy works. Under Venus in Aries, minor actions can carry disproportionate force. A single step can open what months of thinking could not. A simple act of initiative can break a stalemate, change the temperature of a relationship, call opportunities into view, and accelerate a process that once felt trapped in slow motion. This is one of the deepest laws of the transit. When you move, life moves. That changes everything fast. There is a reason this period feels so charged for people willing to act. It creates a field in which initiative becomes visible, as though the world itself becomes more sensitive to motion. The moment a person stops waiting and starts participating, something in the environment begins to reorganize. Not always in a dramatic explosion. Often, it is quieter than that. A reply comes sooner than expected. A conversation opens, shut for months. A project that lived only in the mind begins to gather structure or momentum. It can feel uncanny, as though the world had been waiting for a signal. Before the first move, everything exists in suspension. Ideas remain trapped in thought. Desires remain private. Possibilities hover at a distance, untested and unrealized. People can live in that suspended state for years. They have visions. They have longings they rarely name aloud. They know there is more in them than what their life is expressing. But because they are waiting for perfect timing, perfect confidence, or perfect certainty, nothing enters motion. Their world does not collapse, but it does not open either. It becomes a neutral limbo where potential survives without becoming reality. Aries breaks that spell. Aries is the force that interrupts the holding pattern. It refuses to let possibility remain theoretical forever. It applies pressure where life has become too still. It asks for movement before reassurance arrives. And when Venus joins that force, the movement is not random. It is directed toward what matters, what calls, what feels alive. This is why the energy can be so transformative. It does not simply make people restless. It compels them to move toward something genuine. And that first movement matters more than people realize. The instant you act, you send a signal, not only to your own psyche, but around you. The signal says, I am available. I am no longer only imagining. I am willing to engage with consequence. I am willing to be met. That willingness changes the atmosphere. People notice it. Opportunities notice it too. The world responds differently to a person in motion than it does to a person standing on the edge, rehearsing possibility. This is why boldness during Venus in Aries can look magnetic. Someone sends the text they have been delaying, and the reply becomes the opening to something larger. Someone shares an idea they have been building, and suddenly others see its value and want in. Someone finally speaks with honesty instead of caution, and a stagnant connection either deepens or clears. From the outside, these moments can appear accidental, as if fortune simply arrived one afternoon and turned the lock. But what often goes unseen is the precise moment when the person involved chose movement over hesitation. The chain reaction did not begin with luck. It began with willingness. That is how momentum works in every meaningful arena. Once you act, you begin receiving information that thought alone could never provide. You learn who is responsive and who is not. You discover what holds weight and what falls flat. You find out what wants refinement and what wants expansion. Action educates. Participation reveals. Each step generates knowledge that makes the next step clearer and easier to claim. Progress stops feeling like something you are trying to force and starts feeling like something you are entering, shaping, and allowing. Venus in Aries intensifies this process because it binds movement to sincere desire. It does not ask you to act for appearance, performance, or ego theater. It asks you to move toward what is actually alive in you. That matters, because people can feel the difference. When action comes from a place of real desire, honest curiosity, honest longing, honest creative voltage, it carries a different kind of presence. It becomes more coherent, more compelling, more real. Even when it is quiet, it has heat, and heat draws response. You can see this everywhere once you know how to look. A person reaches back out to someone they have not stopped thinking about, and that contact becomes the beginning of an unexpected doorway. A creator shares work that had been hidden in notebooks and hard drives, and the right eyes find it. Someone finally says what they feel instead of managing everyone else's comfort, and the truth reorganizes the entire relationship. In each case, the initial act is not necessarily grand, but it creates movement, and movement changes the field. That does not mean every bold act will produce immediate triumph. This transit is not a fairy tale, and initiative is not a magic trick. Some steps lead to redirection rather than reward. Some conversations clarify what cannot continue. Some efforts reveal that a door is closed. But even then, action has done its sacred work. It has replaced paralysis with truth. It has exchanged fantasy for information. It has moved you out of stagnation and into relationship with reality. And reality, even when it stings, is more fertile than indefinite postponement. This is another hidden strength of Aries energy. Acceleration. Once movement begins, life can speed up with startling force. One message becomes 3 conversations. One honest decision creates room for new options. One act of self-trust begins altering the way you speak, choose, create, and respond. People often look back on these periods and realize that the entire sequence began with one small move they almost did not make. That is the mystery of momentum. It compounds. It gathers. It teaches the nervous system that action is survivable, that response is possible, that the future is not built through endless preparation alone, but through contact. And that is the deeper invitation here. Venus in Aries is not asking you to become reckless. It is not glorifying chaos or romanticizing blind leaps. It is asking something far more demanding, that you recognize when a desire has become real enough to deserve movement, even before certainty arrives, that you honor the spark while it is still warm, that you understand the first step is often more powerful than the perfect plan. Because when you finally choose motion over delay, something profound happens. The world has something to answer. Your energy stops circling inward and starts transmitting outward. Paths that could not appear while you were frozen begin showing themselves. Help arrives. Friction clarifies. Openings reveal their seams, and sometimes a single act of courage, quiet and almost invisible to everyone else, becomes the hinge that turns the next chapter of your life. The final revelation in this transit is not simply what it stirs, but who it lifts. Venus in Aries does not favor the polished performer, the endlessly cautious strategist, or the person waiting for permission from certainty. It answers the ones who have been building in silence, the ones who kept showing up when no applause came, the ones who kept refining the craft, guarding the vision, carrying the desire, even while the outer world remained unimpressed. This is the hour that often finds them, because this energy does not reward appearance. It rewards readiness. Not the readiness of perfect plans, but the readiness of inner alignment. If you have been tending a dream in private, strengthening a skill in obscurity, shaping a future no one else could yet see, Venus in Aries can act like a match touching dry wood. What was prepared in hidden places suddenly becomes capable of ignition. The distance between effort and evidence begins to shorten. This is why timing feels different here. Many people imagine the right moment as something they must locate, as if success lives somewhere outside them, waiting behind flawless conditions. But this transit reveals a harsher, holier truth. The right moment is often created by movement itself. The first step does not confirm the timing. It becomes the timing. The instant you begin, the field changes. Doors that looked sealed show their seams. Contacts appear. Momentum gathers around what has finally been given form. And the people who benefit most are often the ones willing to trust the signal before the full map appears. Not recklessly, not theatrically, but honestly. They move toward what feels alive. They choose participation over endless design. They stop asking whether they are completely ready and start proving that readiness can be built in motion. A message gets sent, a truth gets spoken, a project gets named aloud, and because the act is sincere, the response carries force. There is another group this transit favors, those whose devotion has been invisible, the quiet workers, the disciplined makers, the ones who have laid foundation after foundation with no immediate reward. When Venus in Aries touches that kind of preparation, things can accelerate with startling speed. What took months to build may suddenly become visible. What seemed stalled may surge. What looked like delay may reveal itself as incubation. But sincerity is everything. This energy is not impressed by noise. It responds to what is real. If your action comes from genuine desire, genuine conviction, genuine willingness to engage, the ripple begins. Opportunity meets courage. Courage deepens trust. Trust invites the next step. That is how momentum becomes destiny. And that is the final lesson here. Do not wait to feel finished. Begin while the fire is present. Begin before certainty arrives. Begin, and let the next door recognize you. What changes your life in this window is rarely spectacle. It is one clean decision, taken in faith, that teaches the universe you are finally available now. As we come to the end of this reading, do not mistake this transit for background atmosphere. Venus in Aries is not ornamental. It is not passive. It is a living summons. It is a moment in time that asks something of you. Not someday, not when every variable is settled. Now, while the signal is still clear, what this passage through Aries reveals is simple, but not easy. Life changes when you stop standing outside it. The path does not always appear in full before the first move is made. More often, the first move is what calls the path into view. That is the law here. Courage before certainty, motion before mastery, participation before proof. So, take a hard look at the places where you have been delaying your own becoming. The conversation you keep postponing, the desire you keep reducing, the idea you keep protecting so carefully that it never enters the world, the decision you already know but continue burying beneath analysis. This transit exposes those places not to shame you, but to confront you with timing. There are openings that do not remain open forever. There are moments when the soul is nearer to action than usual. This is one of them. If something in you has been stirring while you listen to this, pay attention. If a name returned, if a vision sharpened, if a truth pressed harder against your chest, if a next step became impossible to ignore, that is not nothing. That is where the work begins. Honor it. Move with it. Even a small act, taken honestly, can alter the entire sequence of what follows. Venus in Aries does not ask for noise. It asks for sincerity. It does not demand recklessness. It demands willingness. The real shift happens when you stop waiting to feel perfectly ready and decide to meet the moment as you are. That is when momentum begins answering you back. You do not need to force destiny. You only need to answer it. One clear choice, one honest gesture, one act of self-trust can send a message through the unseen. I am no longer rehearsing my life. I am entering it now, fully, awake, for good. If this message found you at the right time, let it become more than inspiration. Let it become action. Leave a comment and tell me what step is calling you now, and if this spoke to something real in you. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you stay close to these transmissions. We go deep here every week. For now, trust the spark. that arrived before fear started negotiating. Trust the movement that wants to begin. The door is open. Step through it while it still is.